Okay, guys. So we were discussing risk assessment last week. We basically covered the first topics or the first part of the element number three. So last week we covered the main topics. Let me just take you back last week. So last week we discussed about health and safety culture. We discussed the definition of health and safety culture. We discussed the positive and negative culture and what are the indicators which we can use to assess safety culture of an organization. We discussed about how peers can influence each other workers. We discussed about improving the safety culture. What are the most important factors which include managed commitment. This can help improve the safety culture, competence of workers, good communication. It can improve the safety culture of an organization. We discussed the benefits and limitations of various communication methods. We discussed about broadcasting methods. We discussed about consultation and information, the difference between these two. We also discussed about health and safety committee meetings. We discussed about training. It can improve safety culture. We also discussed the contents of an induction training. Then we discussed the factors which influence safety related behavior. So those factors include the job factors, organizational factors, and individual factors. So we discussed the organizational, job, and individual factors. We discussed about attitude and risk perception, and we did a few exercises. So today we're going to cover risk assessment. Risk assessment, as I discussed with you guys, this is the most important topic of the entire Nebosh IGC course. What you're going to learn today, you are going to use it to prepare your risk assessment, your practical assignment. So please pay attention. Risk assessment is very, very important to understand, and you need to have good concepts regarding risk assessment. Okay, now before we move on to the definitions of risk assessment, we need to understand what a risk is and we need to understand what a hazard is. So basically, the definition of a hazard is something with the potential to cause harm. Now, this something means it can be anything, anything which has the potential to cause harm. Potential basically means power, ability, potential. So anything which can cause harm is called a hazard. For example, any what you call it sharp objects which are placed near you, working at height, that's a hazard because if you fall from height, you can get injured. A knife which you are using in the kitchen that can cause you harm, so that is also a hazard. And these hazards, they can exist in various forms. Okay, so the health hazard, basically they could be physical health hazards, they could be chemical health hazard, biological, ergonomic, and psychological. So what are the physical health hazard? Physical health hazards include noise. Noise is something physical. It can damage your hearing and it can cause harm to your body. So noise is a hazard. Then another hazard, another physical hazard is vibration. When you're exposed to various tools or various equipment which vibrate, that vibration, it disrupts your blood circulation and it can cause you harm. So noise and vibration are physical hazards. Then there are chemical hazards. What are the chemical hazards? In the workplace we use a lot of chemicals. For example, we use in concreting activities, we use cement. Cement is a chemical. If you have cement on your skin and if you get some water over it, it can cause you skin burns. Or dry cement on your repetitively, if you are exposed to it, you will get allergy or you will get dermatitis on your skin. Similarly, there are other chemicals such as cleaning chemicals. Cleaning chemicals, if you swallow them by accident or if they enter your eyes, they can cause you harm. Okay, so all chemicals in the workplace are basically hazards because they can cause you harm. Paint, spray paint which you are using on your workplace, if you breathe in the vapors of that spray paint, for a long period of time, it can cause you lung cancer. So that is another hazard which is in the workplace, and it is a chemical hazard. Then there are biological hazards. What are biological hazards? Biological hazards are basically related to the various bacteria, viruses, and funguses which we are exposed to. So biological hazards, obviously, they include nowadays. There's a very common biological hazard called the coronavirus. So COVID-19 is a biological hazard which we are exposed to in the workplace. Other than that, we are exposed to hepatitis virus, AIDS virus. There are many other viruses which we are exposed to. There are bacteria which we are exposed to in the workplace, such as Legionella, the Leptospira. So all of these bacteria, they can cause serious diseases, serious illnesses, and hence they can also cause harm. Okay. Then there are ergonomic hazards. Ergonomic, basically, this is the branch of science which deals with the relationship of the workers with their workplace. So if you sit in an awkward position for a long time, it can cause you back pain. So ergonomic hazards are also there. Then there are psychological hazards such as bullying in the workplace. If your supervisor or manager is too strict, is too harsh, and he shouts at you all the time, it can cause you physical damage, physical harm. So all of these uh, are the various hazards which we are exposed to in the workplace. So, guys, this is the definition of hazard. Hazard, as I discussed, is anything which has the potential to cause harm. Now, let's discuss about risk. What is risk? When we talk about risk, we must remember that risk is not only based on one factor. Risk is based on two factors. What are those two factors? Number one, risk is based on the likelihood of the harm occurring. Okay, likelihood, how many chances are there that a given hazard is going to cause harm? That is called likelihood, the chances or the probability of being injured or being harmed from a hazard. Now we need to consider another factor. What is that? How serious the harm is going to be. How severe is the harm going to be? So the risk is basically likelihood of the harm occurring in combination with the severity of the foreseeable harm. So how likely is it that a hazard is going to give us harm, and how severe that harm is going to be? So that is called a risk. Risk is a combination of severity and likelihood. So risk is basically, if you put it in a mathematical formula, risk is equal to likelihood sorry about my handwriting, multiplied by severity. So risk is a product of likelihood and severity. You cannot define risk without considering both factors. You cannot assess the risk without considering both factors. So you must always consider both factors when you define risk. How likely is it that a given hazard is going to cause harm, and how severe the harm is going to be? So, severity is the seriousness of the harm. For example, if you get a minor cut, the severity is low. If you get a broken finger, the severity is slightly higher. You can say severity is medium. Or if you get a broken arm, the severity is higher. If somebody dies, severity is very high. So these are the various levels of severity that a hazard can result. So this is very important to understand, guys. Risk is a combination of severity and likelihood. So the likelihood of harm occurring in combination with the severity of the foreseeable harm. And every hazard has a certain risk associated with it. Okay. And if you combine all the hazards in one activity, a combination of all those hazards will give a risk profile or an overall risk to that activity or a process. Okay, so this is the difference between a hazard and a risk, and we must remember this. Okay, consider a specific hazard and discuss the difference between the hazardous properties of the activity, article or substance, and the risk of harm occurring. Okay, now let's discuss about various hazards. Um, who here can give me an example of an hazard? Guys, I need your input here. Give me an example of a hazard.
Sir, the water spillage on the floor or
Water
the oil
spillage
spillage.
of the water spillage on the floor. Okay, so Puneet, you said the water spilled on the floor is a hazard. How is it a hazard? What can happen? What harm can occur from it?
So some any one of the worker, if they're working on that place, can slip from there, trip and fall could happen.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So basically, hazard is the source which can cause harm. So water spilled on the floor, it is called a hazard. Why? Because it fits the definition. What is the definition of a hazard? Something with the potential to cause harm. Okay, so does the water spilled on the floor have the potential to cause harm? Yes, because if a worker slips over it, he will fall down, he might break his arm, he might get bruises, he might get a cut, he might get an injury. So this water which is spilled on the floor can cause harm. So it has the potential to cause harm, hence it is a hazard. Okay. Now, so what is the hazardous property? The hazardous property of this, what you call it, water spilled on the floor is that it can cause slippage. A person can slip over it and it can get injured, and the person can get injured. Now, the risk of harm occurring. Now, if the water is spilled on a walkway, consider that water being spilled on a floor which nobody walks on. Now, these are two different situations. One situation when water is spilled over some tiles and workers are often walking on those tiles. And the second condition is that the water is spilled on some soil. Now, in which condition, in which situation is the risk higher?
On the ties.
On the tiles. Why? Because the
It can
workers are
easily
so the
slip.
likelihood of injury on the water spilled on the tiles is higher. Why? Because so many people walk over it. Also, the water will not dry off the tiles very fast, whereas the likelihood from injury from the water spilled on the ground or the soil, it is low because very few workers will walk from there, and also the water will get absorbed in the soil very easily, hence the slippery surface will not exist and the risk of being injured is lower over there. Okay, so risk basically, the hazard is the same, spilled water. The hazard was spilled water, but changing the situation slightly reduces the risk or increases the risk. So when we are carrying out the risk assessment, we need to consider all of these factors. We need to consider how many people there are, who is going to get injured, and how they are going to get injured. Here are some more hazards example which people have given. Unguarded machinery such as a grinder. Yes, that is also a hazard. How is an unguarded machinery such as a grinder hazard? When you are using a grinder, when you're operating a grinder, the grinding disc is rotating at very high speed. Okay, so what can happen? Your hands, your arms, or your body parts, they can come in contact with the moving disc and it can cut your body, it can give you bruises. Okay, now the risk basically here is that you will get an injury, you will get cuts and bruises, and the risk is higher. But if you wear personal protective equipment, if you wear gloves properly, if you wear grinding gloves, Now what has happened? You have reduced the level of the risk. Okay. And if you provide a guard over the grinder, you have reduced the risk further. So you have reduced the likelihood and the severity of being injured. Okay. So this is how we define risk, and this is how we define hazard. Here are a few other examples which I'm getting on the chat box. Um, Uninsulated electrical cables. Yes, that is also a hazard. How is that a hazard? Obviously, if you touch the uninsulated cable, you will get an electrical shock. So it can cause you injury, it can cause you harm. That is also a hazard. Broken ladders. Broken ladder is also a hazard. Why? Because if you're working on a broken ladder, you might fall off the ladder and get injured, and you will be in trouble. So that is also a hazard. Working at height without PPE. Yeah, you can say that is also a hazard. Basically, working at height itself is a hazardous activity. Whether you wear PPE or whether you don't wear PPE, that is different. But if you're working at height, that is a hazard. If you are wearing PPE, even then you can fall if your PP is damaged or if it is broken. So working at height is a hazard itself. It is an activity, but it is a hazardous activity. Manual lifting, yes, that is also a hazard. Heavy loads, when you lift heavy loads, that is also a hazard, which can cause you harm. Working under a suspended load, yes, Suresh, that is also a hazard, because if you are working under a suspended load, okay, there is no telling when the slings might fail and the suspended load will fall. If that load falls and you're standing underneath it, you will be crushed. So it has the potential to cause you harm. So as we discussed, anything which has the potential to cause harm is a hazard. So working under suspended load, or you can simply say suspended load, is a hazard. Working under suspended load becomes an activity. You can still call it a hazard, but I'd rather say you call suspended load the hazard. So the load, suspended load is the hazard, and working under the suspended load is a hazardous activity. Working under the suspended load is a hazardous activity. Okay, there are a lot of other examples coming here. Noisy machinery, yes, machinery which is generating noise is a hazard. It can cause hearing damage. Man-machine interface is also a hazard. Whenever you're exposed to equipment, machinery, that can cause you harm. Biological agents is a hazard, but it is a very generic term for a hazard. Okay, so you can say COVID-19 is a hazard. You can say that if you're working inside a hospital, you can say that the contaminated sharps are a hazard, or the contaminated needle which is contaminated with somebody else's blood, which might carry those bacteria or viruses, that is a hazard. So biological agents, Azhar, you mentioned biological agents, but that is a very generic and very big term. Try to be specific when you mention a hazard. Okay, standing under the boom of a crane, yes, that is also a hazard. Flames generated by welding, that is also a hazard, yes. Fumes at a petrol station, yes, that is also a hazard. So that's very good, guys. I think you guys understand what a hazard is. Now, a hazard has various other terms related to it. Okay, there is something known as the consequence of the hazard. What is the consequence of the hazard? The consequence of the hazard is the outcome of the hazard. Okay, now there are various other definitions. There is a hazard, a hazardous event, and the consequences. A hazard in itself, if it is present somewhere, it will not cause harm. It will only cause harm when a hazardous event takes place. Okay, for example, if there is oil or water spilled on the floor, that is a hazard. If it is isolated, it is not causing any harm. When will it cause harm? When a hazardous event takes place. What is a hazardous event? A hazardous event is when somebody walks and slips over that spilled oil or water. That is a hazardous event. Okay, something happens, an occurrence has taken place. So somebody was walking and they slipped over that water or oil. That is a hazardous event. And what is the consequence of this hazard and hazardous event? The person will fall down and he will get seriously injured. He might get a broken arm, he might get a bruised head, he might get a fractured elbow. So these are the consequences of that hazard and consequences of that hazardous event. What is the risk of being injured from spilled water? Now we can say that if the water is spilled on a floor or on the walkway on the tiles, the risk of somebody slipping and getting injured from it is high. But if the water is spilled on soil where it is absorbed quickly, we can say that the risk of somebody being injured from water spilled on soil is low. So risk is a rating. It is either high, medium, or low. Okay, so these are some things which we will discuss in a lot more detail further. This is just something which I just wanted to clarify with you guys. Okay, now let's move on to certain other key words and phrases such as risk profiling. What do we mean by risk profiling? Risk profiling is basically the process of identifying and assessing a range of risks that threaten an organization along with the recognition of their likelihood and probable impacts. So basically, risk profiling is when you look at the range of risks proposed to the threat that threaten the organization, the range of risks that are posed to an organization, and once you look at them, you need to look at the control measures in place, okay, and then you can propose further controls and prioritize them. So risk profiling is something which we do in order to understand the range of risks that are posed to an organization, and then it will help us prioritize the controls as well. So this is called risk profiling. How do we do risk profiling? Risk profiling basically it looks at the nature and level of the threats faced by the organization. It looks at the likelihood of those adverse effects occurring. So how many chances are there that that adverse effect will happen, and how much disruption and cost will be associated with that risk. So these risk profiling is a high level risk overview. Okay, you don't look at everything in minute detail, but you have a bird's eye view of it. Okay, a high level view of it. And we also discuss the effectiveness of the controls in place. What is the outcome of risk profiling? Basically, the outcome of risk profiling will be that the right risks have been identified and prioritized for action, which means you will not give disproportionate importance or priority to low risks. Okay, so the outcome of risk profiling will be that the right risks have been identified and prioritized for action, and the right control measures have been identified and implemented, and minor risks have not been given disproportionate priority. When you prioritize certain risks, you need to give more priority to major risks. Minor risks, which will not cause serious harm, or when the risk is low, they need to be given less importance. Major risks, which are immediately threatening to the organization, which can cause serious disruption and can result in catastrophes, they must be given very high priority. So this is the main purpose of risk profiling. Risk profiling helps you look at the range of risks, the nature of the risks posed to an organization, and it will help you prioritize the actions that need to be taken to manage those risks. Okay, the risk profiling process consists of, first of all, identifying the risks that threaten the organization, then identifying the safety impacts and the business impacts of each threat, identify how well each threat is controlled, identify the likelihood of each threat happening, and prioritizing these threats. Okay, so next terminology is risk assessment. There's a slight difference between risk profiling and risk assessment. Risk profiling is a high level study which discusses the range and type of and the nature of risks which are posed to an organization, and it is mainly used for prioritizing. Okay, what is a risk assessment? Risk assessment is a formal process of identifying preventive and protective measures by evaluating risks arising from a hazard and considering the adequacy of existing controls and deciding whether the risk is acceptable or not. So basically what we do in a risk assessment is we look at what the hazards are available, what are the risks being posed by those hazards, and then we look at the existing controls and we decide whether those existing controls are sufficient or not. If they are not sufficient, then we will decide on additional control measures to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. So this is called a risk assessment. What is the purpose of the risk assessment? Definitely, number one is to prevent death and personal injury, prevent all types of loss incidents, prevent breaches of the law, and prevent the costs of the incidents. Guys, please do not annotate. Okay. So what is a suitable and sufficient risk assessment? A suitable and sufficient risk assessment is a risk assessment which identifies all significant risks. So you need to cover all the significant risks in order for a risk assessment to be suitable and sufficient. Also, a suitable and sufficient risk assessment enables the employer to identify and prioritize control measures. So in a risk suitable and sufficient risk assessment, you need to give risk ratings. Okay, you need to be able to identify and prioritize which control measures are important. It will also help give appropriate. It is also appropriate to the nature of the work and proportionate to the risk, and it is valid for a reasonable time, which means you must review it after a certain period of time as well. Okay, so what are the sources of information that you can use for carrying out risk assessment? How will you carry out risk assessment? Before carrying out risk assessment, you need some information. Where can you get that information? Internally and externally. So what are the internal sources of information? The internal sources of information can be your accidents which are happening. So if you want to carry out risk assessment, look at what are the causes of your accidents. The causes of the accidents will be your hazards. Okay, so you look at the things which are causing your accidents, then you need to consider control measures to reduce risk from those accidents. So before carrying out risk assessment, look at the previous accident reports, look at the sickness and absence data. The sickness and absence data will tell you how many people are taking sick leaves and how many people are being absent and why they are being absent, which will lead you towards certain hazards as well. Okay. Also, when you're doing a risk assessment, you need to look at other internal records such as your what you call it, previous inspection reports. Those inspection reports, they will identify certain hazards and have certain findings that will also help you in the risk assessment. Look at your previous audit reports. Look at the internal minutes of meetings. Okay. So all of these things, read the internal safe working practices, read your internal safety procedures, your standard operating procedures. It will tell you how you should be doing that work properly. So these are internal sources of information that you can use in a risk assessment. What are the external sources of information that you can use in a risk assessment? Obviously, the first thing which comes to your mind is the legal requirements. The legal requirements will tell you what are the regulations that you need to follow in order to protect your workers. So in order to propose additional control, you should look at the legal requirements. Okay. You should also look at best practices, international best practices. For example, from the Health and Safety Executive, from the ILO website, you can get a lot of information from the ILO codes of practice and the Health and Safety Executive website. So that is also an external source of information which will help you identify additional controls. Or you can look at other companies' risk assessments as well, and you can get information from them. You can get information from the insurance companies as well. So look at your company's insurance records, okay? Get information from the insurance company. So all these are internal and external sources of information which can help you identify risks associated with your job. Okay, what are the 5 steps of risk assessment? Basically, we'll discuss these 5 steps and then take a break. So basically, in order to carry out a risk assessment, you must follow these 5 steps. Step number 1 is to identify the hazard. Step number 2 is to identify the people who might be harmed and how. Step number 3 is to evaluate the risk and decide on precautions. Step number 4 is record the significant findings and implement them. And step number 5 is to review and update as necessary. So these are the steps involved in carrying out a risk assessment, which we are going to discuss in detail after the break. So guys, let's take a small break. What time is it now? It's 3:36. So 15 minutes and we will start at 3:50. Okay. So let's take a break for 15 minutes and then we'll be back after that. All right, guys. So we'll see you after the break. Okay.